Hello.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for being on the show.
Absolutely, excited.
So I guess I wanted to start with the last time I was with you. You may remember, you may not, but it was Pulse in May, Pulse 19 in May. You were on main stage, and the lights went off, spotlight went on, and you had a very authentic conversation on human first leadership.
Yeah.
And really I came up to you afterwards and I said, Allison, I thought it was very brave to put a little bit of yourself out there. You were talking about the humanity and technology and being, that challenge, sometimes being at odds with each other. I would just love to learn the backstory of why you wanted to do that.
Yeah.
And what it's mean and why is it so important? Why is that a part of your voice today?
I love that you started with that. It's interesting. I think in some ways, you mentioned that moment felt brave to you. I think maybe in some ways it was. In some ways, actually, I think so much of our population feels the way that I described, that to me, it was just more about speaking the truth for so much of the human experience nowadays than it was, I think, stepping out there and saying something that I thought was controversial. But I really appreciate that you thought it was brave.
Because you were vulnerable.
Yeah.
I think the courage was, maybe we all think it, you said it. You said it on a main stage, and you also talked about your own journey.
Yeah, and I'll tell you about my journey. So much of my childhood was spent outdoors. My brother and I were always like digging in the dirt for insects, which in retrospect were probably our victims as opposed to the friends that we thought. We were always like creating forts out of some substance or other. I just remember just rolling around in the grass and the leaves or whatever, the snow, whatever season it was, like we were rolling around in something.
Where was home?
Suburban Philadelphia.
Really? Whereabouts?
Yeah, do you know Wayne?
Sure.
Or King of Prussia? We're best known for the mall.
I grew up in Jenkintown.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, I didn't realize that. Pennsylvania native.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay, so you're rolling around the grass in King of Prussia, Wayne area, right?
Yeah, and when I think about my childhood, I think about like the birds chirping and the cicada killers chirping, right. And there was just this like very vibrant ecosystem that I remember being a part of. And I think as I've grown into an adult, transition into the tech industry, and it's been my life for a long time now, I noticed that the way in which we often approach technology doesn't recognize the essential interplay between people and nature, and doesn't always put the person in the forefront of the kind of experience that we're looking to create, or maybe even a broader human notion of how humans should exist, I think just isn't at the forefront.
The screen trumps the person.
Yeah, and I'll give you a bunch of examples of how I think tactically this plays out, and I'm certainly not the first to talk about this, many people have. But of course, all the issues around privacy, all the concerns with, as you said, screen time, the fact that ADD appears to be on the rise, that I think it's Sherry Turkle from MIT talks a lot about how kids, I think, don't recognize facial expressions and like emotions in people as much as they used to when they are so focused on screens. You walk around San Francisco and everyone's on their phone. I was actually talking with an Uber driver the other day, a Lyft driver actually, and he was saying how he was actually quite friendly in talking with me. And I said, it's so rare actually that like a Lyft driver will talk to you, engage. Like usually it's just, I'm in the back seat, like he or she's in the front, and you kind of, they're sort of controlled by Google Maps or like whatever direction system they're using, and like we're in the back, on our own phones. And it's just this very like alienating experience. He was saying how he's the kind of guy who likes to like talk to someone when they're in line at the grocery store, but everyone thinks he's weird when he does it. And there's a lot of talk about how like David Brooks talks about the decline of community, how people feel so lonely, and mental illness is on the rise. And I just think how, in the tech world, we consider ourselves to be on the forefront of developing the next generation of whatever, like the next stage of humanity. We're about predicting the future. And honestly, if the future is about like alienation, loneliness, lack of community, people being addicted to their screens, not paying attention to their kids, like that to me is a sad future. And so again, I'm not the only one to say this. Actually, the first person who I ever saw speak about this was Katarina Fake, who was the co-founder of Flickr, and also I believe a company called Hunch.
Okay.
And she was, I think, an artist by training, and for a long time has been talking about the importance of technology addressing real human needs, and that we need to put the human first. I saw her give a speech once where she talked about the Amish, and how, like, you and I talked about being from Pennsylvania, right? Like the Amish
Lancaster area, right?
Right, like a community, primarily I think in central Pennsylvania, I think believe also like Ohio, and they're known for, as people think, not adopting technology. But she pointed out that actually they do adopt technology. It just takes them, they're very deliberate about evaluating that technology and the effect on their society. So they might gradually adopt a technology, and if it serves them and their values, then over time they will sort of, I guess, adopt it in a more endorsed way. So I'm not an expert on this, and I'm also not saying we should all become Amish, but I do think that more deliberate thought process about how technology should help us is valuable, and I don't think we do enough of it. So anyway, going back to my speech, like to me at Pulse, that was about just sort of tapping into my own feelings that we need to become better connected to nature and better connected to each other, and technology should be enabling that.
Powerful. How do you see that, Allison, impacting in your leadership role, Chief Operating Officer at Gainsight? How do you take those principles and manifest them inside the company?
Yeah, and I can't say we're perfect at this for sure. But I do think there are probably a few things that stem from like this greater philosophy of like connectedness. I think one is that it's very important for client-facing teams to share feedback with product organizations. Often I notice in technology companies in general, we have product and engineering teams that are very bright and well-intentioned, but they're often in their own silo developing what they perceive to be great technology and not recognizing the importance of the preeminence of the value, going back to your podcasting, like the value that product delivers, like that is more important than sort of the coherence of the technology in a sense. So in other words, if the product like looks beautiful and has a great tech stack and maybe meets certain standards of quality in the abstract, but doesn't deliver on a human need, then we have a problem. Like there's a real gap there. And the way that you bridge the gap is by being really in touch with customers and having that kind of empathy. Now, I think product teams need to be sort of demonstrating that empathy themselves with clients. They should be like talking to clients a lot, absorbing the client need, figuring out how to make their product easier to adopt. But there's often that's often not true. And even if they are talking with clients, they may not be doing it for a great enough percentage of their time or listening in the right way. And so client-facing teams, given that that's their job, I think are a really essential conduit of that feedback to product and engineering organization.
And breaking those silos so that there is more of the voice of the customer across these different functions, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Tell me another part of the leadership on human first. I think it's actually starting to find its way in a lot of initiatives or announcements that you see. Recently, there was one for the Business Roundtable where 181 CEOs came out and said, we have this new definition of a company. And it's no longer the Milton Friedman, you're here to maximize profit. It's employee health and wellness and engagement. It's the environment and sustainability. It's, to the David Brooks message, it's building community and recognizing you live in a community. It's making sure, which we love, making sure your value to your customers is clear in the way that you're working with them and you're delivering value. how do you think about that in your leadership role, that we have such kind of a monumental restatement of the purpose of a company, and some companies will gravitate to those, some may chafe on that. Where do you see that going, and how far do you want to take that?
Yeah, this is so important. I do think that CEOs coming out and saying, we believe in success for all, which is, clients, teammates, as well as investors, like the community, we believe in generating great outcomes for all these people, is a great step. I think people really want to hear it. I think they want to see their leaders as being people who care deeply about them as people. Clients want to see that leaders are empathetic. And I think in order to build a great business, that is the kind of philosophy that you have to adopt nowadays, because it's there's demand for it. The market is requiring it.
Yes.
I do think that there's a risk that, not to be too cynical, but I think there's a risk that people talk a lot about it and don't deliver on it. And I also think that it's one thing for CEOs to come out and say it. It's another thing for the funders of those CEOs to come out and say it. Reality is, in technology, most companies are venture backed, not all, but well, maybe not even most, but the ones that you tend to hear about a lot in the news, many of them are venture backed. Whenever you raise money, it comes with targets that you have to achieve.
Make the number, right?
Right, and those investors, they want to make sure that there's not an issue with team members or with clients. They want to see the company having a great brand, but at the end of the day, they're on the hook to their own limited partners to deliver certain returns. So the reality of our economy is such that unless the providers of the capital are changing their own mindset, I think it's very difficult for CEOs to truly deliver on this.
Let me ask, for Allison, when Allison wakes up and thinks about serving do you think about serving the shareholder or the stakeholders, being customers and partners and employees? And then how, in your leadership role, Fortune's one of the most powerful women today, right? In your leadership role, how do you, that's a real Sunday afternoon think, how am I going to structure next week in terms of my time allocations on serving these different constituents, if you look at it from a stakeholder perspective? How do you look at it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll say, and I know you're talking with Nick on this podcast as well, which will be great. Nick is our CEO, and I think he sets an amazing tone for the importance of addressing the needs of all these stakeholders. And I think our board is quite aligned around that too. So I think in general, what that means is at Gainsight, there's considered to be broad-based alignment where if you're helping team members, you believe that will carry into great outcomes for clients, because happy workforce produces better results for clients, and also if people are set up for success, they will be able to do their best work. Similarly, if you're doing great things for clients, that results in stronger retention rates and expansion rates, which in turn provides results to investors. And if you also have the capital from investors, which you're able to get by proving great results, then you're able to invest more in the teammate experience and your clients. So, I think we try as much as possible to make sure that these stakeholders are mutually reinforcing, and that there's consistency in how you can work across them. I think where companies can run into danger is if the fundamental ways in which they interact with these different stakeholders are misaligned. For example, if you've raised a lot of money and promised really high targets, that implies a certain pace that your team members have to be at, right? And so it might be that actually there's a certain subset of the population would be very happy working in that kind of high-paced environment, a certain subset would not be. So I think there's got to be a lot of thought about how to ensure there's alignment, across those groups.
I'll tell you a personal story, and I want to then translate it to a question to you. Growing up in the Philadelphia area, my best friend was Rodney Morrison, African American, and we did everything together. And I remember one day we were sleeping over. I think he was sleeping over my house, and he was so organized and always on time, and I was always a little late, and my hair was sticking up because I was wrestling or something. And I remember him saying to me, "I can't do that, Chad. Like this bag has to be packed a certain way if
Yeah.
I come to some. And it was the first moment in my life of, you know what, Chad, you don't see what Rodney sees.
Yeah.
And Rodney has expectations put on him because of the color of his skin that he has to circumvent, or he has to overcome.
Yeah.
Do you feel, even today, in our modern work environment, do you still carry things as a female leader that we don't see?
Great question. I'm so happy you asked that, and it's so thoughtful. Yes, I carry so much, actually, that people don't see. It's interesting. I was at a dinner last night with about 6 women that was organized as sort of a working group type scenario where people could, in a confidential environment, talk about things that were bothering them and get feedback or thoughts from the group. And one of the things I shared is that I went to school in an all-girls environment for middle school and high school.
Okay.
It was like a secular school, small, private, about 45 girls in a class. And so for the formative years of my life, I was showing up every day, and in this particular environment where femininity was considered to be quite consistent with being strong. So, for example, I mentioned lacrosse was one of my sports growing up.
Right.
And I love lacrosse. I was considered to be a pretty intense player as well. Very, very competitive about it. I was captain of my team senior year. I just love the sport. So much fun. Some of my best memories are from my lacrosse team. And when we would get sort of geared up for games, we would put ribbons in our hair, right? So you would be with your stick, and for folks who don't know lacrosse, you've got a stick, and you're trying to, when someone else has the ball, you try to basically hit their stick with your stick. It's called checking, and you try to check the ball out of their stick so you can take it, recover it, it's a turnover, and carry it, score.
Cradle it.
Exactly, yeah, you got the words. So you, just to help you picture this, you could be checking someone and your ribbons are flying everywhere, and that's a very common image, in girls lacrosse, at least where I was growing up. But in our modern day work environment, for me to come to work with the equivalent, an adult equivalent of a ribbon flying in my hair, it's just not common. So, for example, I'll be honest, just yesterday, I took about 10 minutes deciding between 2 different outfits, because one of them was this flouncy, lacy, feminine dress, not scandalous in any way, just feminine dress. And on the other hand, I was thinking wearing a blazer with pants, because I was meeting with someone who I thought might react negatively to the feminine dress.
Right.
And it's a burden on me that it might seem small, but that kind of thing adds up all the time. When you're trying to be yourself and do all the great things that you need to in your job and pursue your dreams, and at the same time you're thinking about silly things like, is it okay for me to wear the thing that I really want to wear today? Wow. I'll give you another example actually from my dinner last night. There was an African American woman who was telling me that for 20 years of her career, she has just bottled up so much that she can't talk about, because she knows from past experience, as well as from her friends' experiences, that when she opens up about things, it hurts her in her career. She was mentioning things and actually I'm ashamed that I didn't know this, but she was saying how when she goes into public restrooms, or even the office restroom where there's an automated faucet in the sink, and she'll wave her hand in front of it, the sensor doesn't recognize her hand in many cases, because she's darker skin. And apparently, although I haven't looked it up, but I trust her, there are tons of YouTube videos showing a white person waving their hand in front of a sensor on a faucet, black person waving their hand, and it'll go on for the white person and not for the black person. And yeah, and I had no idea. But and of course, for her to raise that in a work environment and tell the office administrator, you need to replace the faucets, or come up with a better way of accessing water in the bathroom, because I'm black and I can't access, that's a burden on her in a work environment that shouldn't exist.
Right. Well, 2 good examples. Let's pivot a little bit. As a senior leader in a company that has really defined a whole new category, customer success, I'd love, You've had some recent writings about the role of Chief Customer Officer, and that role being critical in a board position. I'd love you to talk about, maybe my first question would be, Allison, help me understand that role in the context of a CRO, in the kind of a traditional mindset, Chief Revenue Officer for our folks, and let's call it Senior Vice President of Customer Success.
Yeah.
And where that CCO goes and who's more likely to assume that role?
Good question. So there is a lot of fun chaos going on right now, I think, in terms of the constituents on an executive team. We are seeing a number of new roles cropping up, the Chief Customer Officer probably being one of the more recent ones. I remember when I joined Gainsight 6 years ago, there were maybe only you could count the number of Chief Customer Officers on one hand. It was just very infrequently seen as a title. But today there are many, many Chief Customer Officers out there. Chief Revenue Officer, similarly, a newer title. And I'm speaking at a Chief Revenue Officer conference on Friday, so it's sort of interesting, going between these two roles. I sometimes see these two roles existing in parallel. Typically, in cases like that, the Chief Revenue Officer will either purely be a sales leader, so CRO is just in that case a new title for SVP of Sales or Chief Sales Officer.
Right.
Or they might be leading essentially the top of the funnel, sales plus marketing, sort of top line or new logo growth, where, and in that model, the Chief Customer Officer would be running essentially everything post-sale. So customer success management, professional services, customer support. I can't say I love the term post-sale because, as we all know, that organization typically owns the vast majority of the revenue of the company. It's the install base plus, for larger companies, expansion tends to be a huge percentage of new growth. But just for simplicity, I'll use that term. In other situations, you might purely see a Chief Revenue Officer that's running the entire customer journey. And in that case, this person's actually a lot more like COOs at many companies. They're running everything from marketing to sales to customer success. I think their title might change from CRO to COO if then they also run an operations team and maybe the people organization and a couple of other staff type functions. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that there's a perfect solution or answer. I think these different models can work well in different types of situations. One common reason for having one of these models and not the other is if you have a product that is very easy to use out of the box, and perhaps you have a long tail customer base, you may not need a significant professional services component of your business. Support might be pretty lightweight, and your customer success team might be able to have very high account ratios, which might also, and if the product's particularly lightweight, it might also allow them to actually own the renewal and own expansion too. In this world, CSMs are essentially like an account manager, but that's also looking at value and adoption. So in those situations, you might just have the customer success management team report into the revenue organization and then work seamlessly with sales and marketing. And perhaps I've even seen support in situations like this reporting into the product organization because getting tickets is essentially a source of information about evolving the roadmap.
Right. So it's I love how you laid that out, and I think if we look at sales, the function of sales, probably it has gone through more change in the last 4 years than it has in the past 40 years in terms of consumption-based models, subscription-based models. The cloud euphoria has created an environment where you're really seeing a blurring of the lines between sales and customer success. And interestingly, we have this advisory, Ashvin's part of our advisory ecosystem, and next month we have the Chief Customer Officer at Veracode, Mike McGinnis, and the Chief Customer Officer at Anaplan, Christoph Boden. And they're hosting a session just on this question of who owns growth?
Yeah.
Who owns expansion in this blurring of lines? Where do you fall on that, Allison? How do you think about that?
So I think that these questions of who owns growth, who owns the customer, essentially have the same answer, which is the company does. The company does. And I think that we need to orient more toward organizational structures that recognize the importance of collaboration across teams in pursuit of a common goal like growth, as opposed to teams thinking in their silo about like, what is the territory that is mine? Actually, I gave a talk once about, I keep going back to my brother, so hey Andy, lots of shout outs to him. So when my brother and I were little, he was younger, 3 years younger, and he came home from the hospital, and then, within like a year or two, started trying to steal my blankie. If you remember, like the days of like having like childhood blanket, and like I would try to steal the blankie back, and I would say, "No, it's mine."
Right.
And then he would, and then as I would say "mine" a lot.
Right.
And he came to associate the word "mine" with blanket. So he thought the word for a blanket was mine. So then we'd start saying things like, "Give me my mine back. I want my mine." Anyway, like that's the kind of like possessiveness that I sometimes see in this adult organizations. And like I'm joking about it because I think actually we need to recognize sometimes like how childish we can be in terms of like trying to like grab stuff from other people. And in particular, I think growth is just one of those essential goals that a company has, so that really everyone needs to be oriented toward it. Even like the product team should be thinking about how do I make sure that I'm rolling out features that naturally create their own adoption, right? Without even like human intervention. So this feature is released, people naturally open it up and are delighted and get value almost automatically. Right?
I love that idea, because if you look at, I always like to look at disparate things and try to apply them or connect dots. If you look at the way the video game industry works, nobody gives them a manual. They come out with a new release of the game, and somebody downloads that game and they intuitively understand, oh, this is the new part of it, right?
Yeah.
So they can kind of experience a new feature on their own, self-educate on their own. And it seems like that model could be well advised in kind of an enterprise software approach, where you create things so intuitive that somebody can get the next release and not have to have the whole volume of literature on what 5.4.3 means to them.
Definitely.
That they can just experience it.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I went through an onboarding experience that is like what you described recently. There's a company called Superhuman, which has an email inbox that is intended to be next generation. And by the way, I will say that Superhuman, I think, has gotten into trouble in the past for certain like privacy violations that folks perceive them to have. So I'm not going to say this is like necessarily the be-all end-all company. But what's really, I think, interesting and admirable about their onboarding experience is that you can get value from this inbox so quickly, despite the inbox having massive capabilities. For example, the inbox, you're able to navigate it through keyboard shortcuts, much like you might use keyboard shortcuts in Excel if you're like a guru financial modeler. And everyone knows, like in the financial model context, using shortcuts makes you so much faster than like clicking around. What this inbox taught me was that in Gmail, I'm losing so much time by like clicking around to different things. I think that's probably true of like Outlook and like other email systems. But when I'm in Superhuman, which like plugs into those, actually I can just navigate with shortcuts. And so the most important thing about learning the inbox is learning how to use the shortcuts. And for that, they put you on the phone with someone for 25 minutes, if I remember correctly. And they're guiding you through a tour, which also appears on your screen. So there's like a visual walkthrough that happens that guides you through different shortcuts, how to navigate the inbox and achieve certain goals. And although you might think, well, it can't be that advanced if they had to have a human on the phone with you, the reality is, like we talked about before, people benefit from that connection. Sure. So if that onboarding specialist can use an interface as a tool to help me change my behavior, the outcome will be that much more successful. So 25 minutes in, I'm using this, and I'm a pretty heavy user of it.
That's a great example. Tell me, let's use the example of sales and customer success, and I'll use a metaphor that if you and I went to have lunch, and we took some time with the person that came over, and they helped us understand the specials, and we finally came upon, I'm going to get the Cobb salad, and you're going to get, what are you going to get?
Kale salad.
Kale salad, right. And it goes off to the kitchen, and we come 12, 15 minutes later, plates come back, and I have spaghetti, and you have a hamburger. That would not be a great customer experience. But in many respects, all of the ordering, let's say in pre-sales, in enterprise, all these outcome promises that are being done in sales are not being memorialized. They're not being written down on the little ticket to go to the kitchen, and the kitchen filling the order and bringing it back to us. And then the discussion with the customer comes to customer success, and they have to retell their story because they don't know any of the outcome promises that the sales organization. And it just feels like, although we don't tolerate that or wouldn't tolerate that in our everyday life, it's shocking how often sales outcome discussions, and hence some of the work ecosystems and Gainsight are doing, right? But this discussion on outcome promises and outcome delivery are two separate conversations, and at the sacrifice of the customer experience.
Definitely.
How does that need to look, that outcome handoff between those two groups?
Yeah, so I'll tell you how we did it at Gainsight. I can't say we're perfect, but I think there are some like nuggets of wisdom in something we've done. We were noticing actually a few years ago that we were talking with our customers a lot about adoption, but they weren't always adopting in a way that got them to the ultimate value point. And we also noticed that, as you implied, sometimes the conversations that the salespeople were having about what motivated the purchase, were not translating post-sale. So we realized we needed a framework to talk about outcomes. We created this methodology that we call the periodic table of customer success elements, which you might have seen. And it's essentially it's a framework that says, here's a maturity curve for customer success. We want to get you from point A to point B. There are 3 stages to get there. And within each stage, there's a certain set of goals or outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Once you achieve those, you'll progress to the next stage. So this became sort of a journey map for us to bring our clients through. And we started using this framework all the way across the customer journey. From like the first time that someone interacts with our website, they'll see the elements table, to when they speak with a salesperson, that salesperson will use that table to do discovery, and also to start talking about what your objectives are. And then, in services, which is the team that does onboarding at Gainsight, you will talk with the client about, sort of recap what you heard in terms of which elements were most important. And then at the executive business review, when you're assessing what value the client has gotten, it's in the context of those outcomes.
Okay, great.
So I think step one for us has been having that same framework, the same language essentially,
the
that
lingua franca,
everyone can speak to.
Yeah, from pre-sales all the way through.
Yeah. So notably, like, it's a language, it's also a standard set of objectives that you should be able to achieve with our software.
Okay.
So it minimizes the risk of making a mistake. Now I'll also say, and this is a bit more provocative, I think in environments where, which is I think most sales teams, where commission is such a heavy percentage of your salary, and where in many cases those salespeople are handing off the customer to a team and not speaking to them again, so like therefore not really on the hook.
Right, right.
You're kind of creating incentives for there to be misalignment between sales and the customer and sales and the rest of the organization. And my hunch is that kind of compensation structure is probably dated.
Yes.
I'm starting to talk to CEOs who are actually interested in paying their sales reps simply base salary. It's a high base salary. You can get promoted over time. So you can, if you do well, you get rewarded from that. Like in other functions, you can get promoted and make more money. But it's a base salary so that you're just motivated to do the right thing. You still have targets, right? If you're not meeting your targets, maybe you're not a fit for our organization, but or you need coaching. But yeah.
It's an interest because you can see structure drives behavior, right? There are old Byzantine structures that have driven this behavior of it's the end of quarter, I've got to make my number, and we're going to find a way for you to buy this software, and then that perpetuates shelfware and unhappy customers. And so it's in everybody's best interest to maybe take some of the heat out of the compensation or variable nature and make it something that they can just go solve problems and not worry about pushing something, pushing a sale where it's not needed. If we move personally, so I've learned a little bit about Andy, and I know that your dad used to read bedtime stories to you and Andy.
Yeah.
He's in the middle of the hallway, and the two doors are on either side. Is that the visual?
Yeah, wow, you really did your research. So the way our home was structured was Andy had, we had separate, we were lucky to have separate bedrooms from the time that I was around 5 years old, Andy was 2. And our doors were essentially aligned, so my dad could sit in the hallway between the two doors and tell us stories. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask to talk to a 10-year-old Allison. What posters are on Did Allison have posters on the wall at 10 or not in her bedroom?
Good question. I don't think I had posters actually, but I had. I think I had drawings.
Drawings.
Okay.
Yeah. What was Allison passionate about? What was a shaping story of a young Allison that you carry with you?
I loved the outdoors and sports growing up. I mean, that was I've talked about this a bit with you.
I love that.
It was so formative for me.
And you're hiking. You're a big hiker as well.
Yeah.
So did you find what made it so energizing for you to be outside? What was it? What did you get from nature that you felt made you bigger?
I think it's this feeling of groundedness. Like I am a part of something bigger. Yes. I'm not an atomic entity that exists separately from my environment. Actually, like I'm a part of it. And I think there's just something very natural and universal about like the way that the woods smell. Yes. That like kind of just biologically like gets us excited and energized and attentive, focused. Like actually, I think probably a formative experience for me growing up was a block party that we would host every year in June for our neighborhood. Right. Everyone would come, they bring the food and picnic blankets, and the kids, we would play this game called Ghost in the Graveyard.
Of course.
Do you know? Yeah, you know.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So you might remember, at least the way we played it, I don't know, this is like our neighborhood maybe version of it, but we would stand around this big pine tree, and someone would be named the ghost, and then that person would stand at the tree, cover their eyes, and say, count to 20, or so. You'd say like 1 goes to the graveyard, 2 goes to the graveyard, 3 goes to the graveyard. Everyone would run in all sorts of directions. It'd be dark outside by this point. And then the ghost would have to go find people, and if they tagged someone, then that person would become the new ghost.
Right.
That was it was so fun, just like being part of that.
I can see that, because I remember young too, being when you had the lightning bugs out in that dusk period of time, and you're probably a little sugared up on a popsicle that you had from, and you're just running around crazy.
Yeah.
The other question on a personal front that we always love to ask in each time with our special guest is to our namesake, the voice of value. We have a philosophy and a belief that you find your own value by helping others find theirs. And along the way, we each find our unique thing, our voice, our contribution out to the world. In your journey, Allison, where have you found your voice of value? Where are the things that you feel you're putting out to the world that are uniquely you?
I guess I'll go from the maybe more superficial to the deeper. I think on the surface level, I think what most people know me for is customer success, right? So I joined Gainsight 6 years ago at a time when very few people had the customer success title. And we realized that this was a function that was necessary as companies moved to the subscription model. And the SaaS industry was taking off. Every SaaS company essentially needs a customer success management team. And there were all these people who started coming to our events who didn't really know what they should be doing when they go to work. We didn't really either, right? So we started, even though we were selling software to these people, so we started chatting about, well, what does it mean to be in customer success management? Should we have metrics for this? Even that was a sort of provocative question. Like maybe we should measure what customer success is, and you got to measure what matters, and customers matter. So what processes should they have? What profile of person makes sense in this role? How do you get promoted to be a leader? What title should that leader have? Like, we started having all these conversations, and my team, as we were figuring out all of this internally, my customer success team, we started writing about what we were discovering. And I think, whenever we would come up with an experiment, we would share in blog post form or eventually podcast form, like, what were the beneficial results, as well as what were the mistakes that we had made, quite transparently. One time we accidentally sent a welcome email to all of our clients, even the ones who weren't new. So we messed up. We messed up along the way too. And actually in the situations where we've messed up, actually we've I think gained some points in terms of vulnerability and authenticity.
You just admit it, own it, and I think people become even more endearing to the cause.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So I think that's one, is that over the past 6 years we've very authentically built up this kind of library of best practices, which, going back to your point about helping others see their value, I think it's done its role in helping customer success people see their value. For a function that was almost non-existent, and in many organizations at the bottom of the totem pole, I think together as a community we've gotten this function to be one of the, not that there's a ranking, but an important function, and one that should have a seat at the executive table.
I want to give you a proof point on that first point you give. I have met a senior executive in a Fortune 500 company. We've become friends, and he said, who leads customer success for the company, who said that he was in his job kind of out there on his own in this kind of nascent new function, right? And read a blog by this woman named Allison Pickens about customer success, and realized, wait, there's a community here. There's other people.
I'm not alone.
Right.
Yeah.
So your teaching, your writing has impacted people. I have personal evidence of it. So that's great to hear. What else do you feel is your value?
Yeah, I think a second thing, which has been more recent, is the subject of bravery that I've been chatting about. So 2 years ago at Pulse, I gave a talk about being brave in the context of being prescriptive with clients. So not letting clients go down a path that you believe is highly likely to hurt their own interests in the end, but based on your own experience working with many other clients like them, being able to say, hi, client, I really believe that you should take path A, not path B, even though you're inclined to take path B, because I want what's best for you, and I've really seen path A work well. I think for people in customer success, that's a challenging conversation to have, because many people in customer success are naturally helpers.
Right.
They want to help.
It's counterintuitive to be at odds with what a customer's doing, right?
Right.
Or want to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a tough conversation to have. Not many people like conflict or confrontation. So I gave this talk about how we need to be brave, and I talked about actually my own journey in becoming braver, especially when I was young. I was quite shy actually, and so coming out of shyness was sort of a big part of my journey as a person. And what I learned after that talk was how important bravery I think is for the customer success community in their personal lives. Right? Many people in customer success, like I said, are helpers and or they're women, and they, I think, are inspired when someone says, you can express your point of view. You can be strong,
yes. Yeah.
Even when it's hard. And so anyway, actually, after this, I had someone on LinkedIn who I didn't know message me and say that she had been a whistleblower at her last company, and was wondering if her situation counted as a part of the Be Brave campaign.
Yeah, I think so, right?
Yeah, well, but in retrospect, yes, but at the time I was thinking, this is just a customer success concept.
Oh, it went much wider.
Yeah. So then I thought, that was sort of the first signal to me that said, actually there's something deeper here.
Yeah.
So a few months ago, I launched a podcast called the Be Brave campaign.
Cool.
And it's still early, but I've been chatting with folks who have expressed a point of view that's provocative and but in a way that served a cause that they believe was worthy, where they courageously stood up for what's right.
And I could see things like equal pay. I could see things like diversity being topics that require courage that you can give a voice to.
That's right. Yeah. And some of the subjects that we talk about are about women. Honestly, as a woman in leadership, it's hard not to talk about it. I think that's part of the contribution of the campaign. But then some of the topics are not related to women. For example, just a couple weeks ago, I interviewed an animal rights activist, right? Which, animal rights people are not often the people's favorite. They're not often like popular people. But, I personally believe that what he's doing is very valuable. And I think it's courageous that he's sticking by his guns, and doing what he believes is right.
I had a chance to sit down with Beth Comstock, the former vice chair of GE. She said, Chad, you have to change yourself before you can change others. And I thought, that's so true, right? And I've been through that where I tried to put, and you're the role model I think many people can look towards, and with your podcast, Be Brave campaign, give them a voice.
I hope so. And actually, to your point, for me, Be Brave is a almost cathartic thing. It's a way that I can work on myself and help myself be braver. When I see these folks who I interview,
you get inspired, right?
I get inspired. It inspires me to be brave when I see them be brave. So in a way, it is self-help for me.
Well, this has been inspiring. I enjoyed our time. I really did.
Me too.
Thank
Great
you so
questions.
much. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Chad. This is great.